Hello, everyone. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Prof. Jeffrey Sachs Fan World. And here is today's content. When I first read Beijing's invocation of Articles 53, 77, and 107 of the UN Charter in reference to Japan, a set of clauses dating back to the aftermath of World War II, I was struck not only by the legal maneuver itself, but by the symbolism behind it. China was not simply identifying potential military targets in Japan. It was reviving the language of enemy states, and doing so in a moment of heightened tension over Taiwan. This combination makes the message far more consequential than a standard geopolitical warning. It reflects a deep, increasingly fragile architecture of historical trauma and strategic insecurity in East Asia. To understand the gravity of this signal, we must recall what these articles represent. They are relics of a world shaped by the ruins of fascism, written into the UN Charter at a time when Germany and Japan were still seen as defeated powers whose militarism might yet resurface. Almost no country references these clauses today. They are obsolete, dormant, juridically irrelevant in modern international practice, yet Beijing has deliberately invoked them. Why? Because the symbolism carries emotional and political weight. It reminds domestic Chinese audiences of a century marked by Japanese occupation and violence. It simultaneously warns Tokyo that China views the revival of Japanese military activism, even within the U.S.-Japan alliance, as a kind of historical regression. But China's message does not end with symbolism. It ties this narrative directly to the Taiwan question. Beijing is effectively saying, if Japan inserts itself militarily into a Taiwan contingency, we reserve the right to retaliate on Japanese soil. This is an extraordinary escalation in language because it reframes Japan not as a third-party ally of the United States, but as a principal actor in the sovereignty dispute over Taiwan. And for China, sovereignty is existential, bound tightly to nationalism, regime legitimacy, and long-term strategic identity. In my interpretation, China's statement is not evidence of an imminent plan to attack Japan. Rather, it is a form of coercive deterrence. Beijing wants to dissuade Tokyo from operational involvement in a Taiwan conflict by raising the costs, psychological, political, and military, of such involvement. It is a signal of where China draws its red lines and how far it may be willing to push them if those lines are crossed. Yet the decision to invoke enemy state language is dangerous because it reopens historical wounds in a region where memory has always been a strategic weapon. It suggests that China is no longer merely addressing present-day security concerns. It is situating Japan's choices within a century-long narrative of mistrust. And once history becomes militarized in this way, the space for rational, stabilizing diplomacy narrows dramatically. When I try to interpret Beijing's threat through the lens of its long-term strategic thinking, the first question I must confront is this: is China using Taiwan as a pretext to justify coercion against Japan, or does Tokyo truly sit at the center of China's Taiwan contingency planning? From where I stand, the answer is far more complex than a simple pretext. Taiwan is China's genuine red line, arguably the most emotionally and politically charged issue for the Chinese state. Yet at the same time, Japan is deeply embedded in the strategic geography of Taiwan, making it inseparable from Beijing's core security anxieties. Let me begin with the fundamentals. Taiwan is central to the Chinese Communist Party's identity. It embodies the unresolved civil war, the narrative of national rejuvenation, and the promise repeated in countless speeches that China will never allow permanent separation. For Beijing, Taiwan is not just territory, it is legitimacy itself. Therefore, China views any foreign military involvement in Taiwan as a direct challenge to its sovereignty, almost equivalent to interference in its capital. Japan occupies a uniquely sensitive role in this calculus. The Japanese archipelago, especially Okinawa and the Southwest Islands, provides the United States with the logistical backbone for any future Taiwan-related operation. In Beijing's strategic mind, Japan is not a neutral observer, it is the frontline infrastructure of American deterrence. Japanese bases, airfields, and naval facilities would almost certainly be used for intelligence, resupply, surveillance, and even combat operations in a Taiwan scenario. Beijing knows this, Tokyo knows this, Washington knows this. Thus, when China warns Japan that it will respond militarily if Tokyo interferes in Taiwan, it is not speaking hypothetically. Japan's involvement is structural. There is no Taiwan scenario in which Japan plays no role. Even non-combat support logistics, radar sharing, refueling, would, in Chinese eyes, constitute direct participation. In this sense, Taiwan is not merely a pretext. It genuinely links Japan to China's most deeply held red line. Yet, I must also confront the political dimension. Beijing is fully aware that historical resentment toward Japan can be activated to justify strategic moves. Anti-Japanese sentiment is deeply woven into Chinese education, political discourse, and national memory. By framing the threat within the enemy state language of the UN Charter, China connects present concerns with past grievances, mobilizing domestic nationalism as a form of strategic capital. So while Taiwan is real, the way Beijing frames Japan's role is unquestionably shaped by lingering distrust and the emotional residue of 20th century conflict. This duality, Taiwan as genuine red line, Japan as historical antagonist, creates a combustible mix. From my perspective, China's warning is not merely about deterring Japan, it is also about shaping the regional narrative. Beijing wants to signal that Japan's growing strategic alignment with the U.S. in the Taiwan Strait is unacceptable. It wants to force Tokyo to think twice before deepening its commitments, but it is doing so through the language of past wars and old grudges, which makes the signal far more volatile than Beijing may intend. In short, Taiwan is both a real trigger and a political frame. Japan is caught in the middle not because it seeks conflict, but because geography and alliance commitments make it impossible to stay outside China's core strategic fears. As I reflect on China's invocation of enemy state clauses and its threat rhetoric toward Japan, I cannot escape the reality that this is not merely a matter of contemporary strategy. It is also a profound expression of historical memory, a memory marked by trauma, humiliation, and unresolved emotional wounds. When China speaks about Japan in the language of wartime aggression and militarist revival, it is drawing upon a century-long narrative of resentment. And in East Asia, history is never dead. It is a living force shaping national identities, political legitimacy, and foreign policy behavior. Let me start with the historical backdrop. The trauma of Japanese imperialism in China is immense, lasting from the 1895 annexation of Taiwan to the atrocities of the 1930 seconds and 1940 seconds. The invasion of Manchuria, the occupation of coastal cities, the forced labor policies, the experiments on civilians, and the Nanjing massacre still occupy a central place in Chinese collective memory. The Chinese Communist Party has built much of its patriotic education on these events, framing national rejuvenation as a response to past humiliation. This narrative is not just symbolic, it is foundational. Japan, for its part, has struggled to reconcile with this past. While Tokyo has issued apologies, they have often been perceived in China as insufficient, ambiguous, or politically inconsistent. Disputes over history, textbooks, Yasukuni shrine visits, and political statements create recurring cycles of mistrust. Every time a Japanese politician appears to downplay wartime atrocities, Beijing capitalizes on the moment, reviving the argument that Japan has not fully atoned for its militarist legacy. This historical tension bleeds directly into present-day geopolitics. When Beijing warns Japan about reviving militarism, it is not simply reacting to Japan's defense reforms. It is resurrecting the old narrative that Japan, if unchecked, will return to aggression. From my perspective, this narrative is often exaggerated and politically instrumentalized, but it remains powerful within China. The invocation of Articles 53, 77, and 107 of the UN Charter is especially revealing. These clauses classify Germany and Japan as enemy states from World War II, permitting certain actions against them without Security Council approval. No responsible government today sees these clauses as legitimate tools of diplomacy. Yet China's reference to them shows how history can be weaponized not as legal doctrine, but as political symbolism. Essentially, China is saying, we still view you as a potential aggressor. It is a deeply emotional message hidden within a legal frame. This historical framing also dovetails with China's strategic rivalry with Japan over regional leadership. Japan is the U.S. ally with the greatest economic weight and technological sophistication in Asia. Its potential to counterbalance China is real. China's attempt to intimidate Japan into neutrality in a Taiwan contingency may instead produce the opposite effect, a more assertive Japan with broader regional partnerships. This reaction will in turn reinforce Beijing's sense of encirclement, creating a vicious cycle in which each side's defensive measures appear offensive to the other. What concerns me most is the expanding entanglement of three distinct conflicts: the unresolved historical memories of the Sino-Japanese War, the sovereignty and identity contest over Taiwan, and the broader U.S.-China rivalry for regional primacy. These three dynamics are merging into a single escalation ladder, each amplifying the risks of the others. Meanwhile, China sees its rise as the restoration of historical status, a return to being East Asia's central power. Thus, the strategic rivalry is amplified by historical resentment, creating a psychological environment where misinterpretation can easily escalate into confrontation. In my analysis, the greatest danger is not that China will attack Japan tomorrow, but that both countries are drifting into a narrative trap where history shapes threat perception more than rational calculation. Once history is militarized and folded into strategic signaling, the space for diplomacy narrows sharply. The emotional residue of the past begins to dictate the logic of the present. And this is precisely the point at which geopolitical competition becomes most dangerous. When I examine how Japan is likely to respond to China's latest threat signaling, I see a country caught between deep historical restraint and an increasingly urgent sense of vulnerability. Japan is no longer the passive, constitutionally constrained power it was during the late Cold War. It is a nation gradually redefining its defense posture, pushed by the reality of a more coercive China, a more nuclear-capable North Korea, and a United States that increasingly expects Japan to shoulder a larger share of regional burdens. In this environment, China's rhetoric, especially the invocation of enemy state clauses, will accelerate trends already underway. Let me begin with deterrence. Japan has already embarked on a transformative shift in its defense doctrine. In 2022-2023, Tokyo announced plans to acquire counterstrike capabilities, long-range missiles capable of targeting enemy bases. This marks a dramatic evolution from the purely defensive interpretation of Article 9 of the Constitution. Beijing's threats will reinforce the logic behind these reforms. Japan cannot rely exclusively on defensive posture if potential adversaries threaten retaliation on Japanese soil. I expect Japan to intensify the hardening of its Southwest islands, Okinawa, Miyako, Ishigaki, Yonaguni, turning them into a network of fortified nodes capable of complicating any Chinese military operation near Taiwan or the East China Sea. Japan will likely expand radar installations, missile batteries, and joint naval patrols with the United States. The Japanese self-defense forces and U.S. forces already operate as a quasi-integrated system. China's statements will push them even closer. This brings me to alliance dependence. Japan's security strategy is inseparable from the U.S.-Japan alliance, which Beijing understands clearly. When China warns Japan not to interfere in Taiwan, it is implicitly warning the United States as well. But Japan's leaders cannot simply step back. Any Taiwan contingency will automatically draw Japan in, not out of ideology, but geography. The proximity of Japanese bases to Taiwan makes them indispensable to U.S. Military operations. Thus, China's attempt to intimidate Japan into neutrality is strategically unrealistic. As I reflect on this dangerous escalation in rhetoric between China and Japan, I am struck by a deeper philosophical and geopolitical lesson, one that extends far beyond the immediate Taiwan question. What troubles me most is the reactivation of historical legalism and the mobilization of wartime memory in a region armed with advanced militaries, sophisticated missile systems, and nuclear umbrella arrangements. When great powers reach backward into the emotional archives of past conflicts to justify threats in the present, the result is not deterrence, but destabilization. And East Asia, with its unresolved historical trauma and intensifying great power rivalry, may be the region least able to absorb such destabilizing impulses. Let me begin with the invocation of UN enemy state clauses. These clauses, although still technically present in the UN Charter, are completely anachronistic. No responsible government in the modern world treats Japan or Germany as enemy states subject to unilateral force. The entire post-war international system was built on the premise of reconciliation, integration, and the transformation of former adversaries into partners. Japan has been a cornerstone of that transformation. To resurrect these clauses, even symbolically, is to undermine the very foundations of the UN Charter that China itself claims to uphold. Yet the danger runs deeper than legal rhetoric. China's statement reveals how readily history can become a strategic weapon. By framing Japan as a potential aggressor, not just in military terms, but in civilizational terms, Beijing taps into a reservoir of nationalist emotion that is both powerful and volatile. And while national memory is a legitimate part of identity, it becomes hazardous when deployed in moments of geopolitical tension. In this case, it risks creating a narrative in which Japan's every defense reform is interpreted as militarism and every alliance commitment as interference. That is a recipe for self-fulfilling escalation. Japan, for its part, will not accept such framing quietly. Tokyo's response will be to accelerate the very measures Beijing, closer alignment with the United States, stronger deterrence posture, and deeper integration with emerging Indo-Pacific security networks. A crisis in Taiwan can rapidly draw on Japan. A Japanese response can trigger Chinese counter-threats, and U.S. treaty obligations can transform a regional conflict into a global showdown. This is not a theoretical possibility. It is the structural architecture of today's Indo-Pacific. To avoid such a catastrophic trajectory, East Asia desperately needs a new crisis management framework. This would require China, Japan, the United States, and South Korea to establish channels for military deconfliction, transparent communication, and clear protocols for base usage in a Taiwan scenario. Such institutions will not eliminate rivalry, but they can prevent rivalry from spiraling into war. Ultimately, my conclusion is simple but urgent. History cannot remain the operating system of East Asian security. A nuclear-armed region cannot afford to be governed by emotional residues of the past. Peace will depend on the capacity of China and Japan to move from grievance to governance, from legalistic intimidation to institutional restraint, and from historical memory to future stability.